Let's try and visualize the major pharmaceutical markets around the world and the drug companies that compete and collaborate in these markets. Let's go. The market for pharmaceutical products is dominated by the United States, which is a $500 billion behemoth, which accounts for about 45% of all global pharmaceutical revenue. The next larger markets, China and all of the European Union combined, doesn't even come close to the US. In fact, the US market is comparable in size to all of the rest of the world combined. This explains why the US FDA approval giving access to this market can make or break pharma companies around the world. The US's role is even more pertinent when you consider the dynamics of the second largest market, China. At $150 billion, Chinese customers make up 30% of global pharma spending. And with a 1.4 billion population which is rapidly aging, incidents of chronic conditions like cancer are exploding in China. So much so that the Chinese pharma market is expected to overtake the US and become the largest in the world within a decade. However, the Chinese market has the Great Wall of Protectionism built around it. The regulatory bureaucracy which throws up hurdles to market entry by international companies. Until recently, even drugs that were approved in highly regulated markets like the US and EU had to go through long regulatory routes before they could launch in China. This Great Wall exists to protect the local Chinese pharma industry from competition, an industry which is still heavily reliant on the making and export of raw materials and API instead of cutting-edge finished drugs. This often comes at great cost to the health of Chinese patients who are prevented from accessing therapeutic options widely available outside China. The Indian domestic market, by comparison, is rather minuscule, with annual sales of $12 billion or less than 1% of the global market. In fact, by market capitalization, it would take 24 of India's largest companies, Sun Pharma, to make one Johnson & Johnson. Though its domestic market is small, India is a powerhouse when it comes to pharma manufacturing and exports, making over half of the world's vaccines and over 40% of the generic drugs taken in the US. India is also home to over 20% of all US FDA approved sites. The top pharmaceutical companies in the world are dominated by American firms also, with Johnson & Johnson at top spot. In fact, 6 of the top 11 companies by revenue are American, and only one company, Sinopharm, is Asian. When you hear the term pharmaceutical marketing, the picture which likely springs to mind is that of a humble medical representative, patiently waiting outside a doctor's office to pitch the company's products and make a business-to-business or B2B sale. Pharmaceutical companies around the world rely on such B2B channels almost exclusively. Even if a pharma company wanted to make a direct B2C or business-to-consumer sale, they'll hit upon a couple of roadblocks. First, most pharmaceutical drugs are regulated by governments who do not want to encourage direct sales because of the possibility of misuse. And second, in a lot of developed markets like Europe, healthcare, including medicines, are usually free, paid for by government agencies, meaning consumers don't have a need to deal directly with the drug company at all. In fact, direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising, or DTCPA, for prescription drugs is prohibited almost everywhere, other than the US and New Zealand. So for a drug company to get its product to the patients who need it, they have to rely on a host of B2B intermediaries. Hospitals and clinics, like the ones where the medical rep was waiting, insurance companies who may purchase in bulk to distribute against potential claims, government agencies like the UK's NHS adding to their stockpile, and pharmacy chains and wholesalers whose business it is to distribute drugs and make a profit. Relying on intermediaries have worked pretty well so far for pharma companies because they bring some distinct advantages, like having the required professional licenses, like in the case of a doctor, to prescribe and distribute drugs to the public, logistics network to store and transport drugs effectively. They reduce liabilities on the drug companies in case of misuse or accidents. And finally, these intermediaries bring volume sales and economies of scale because of their deep pockets. But in the age of data, what's worked so far may not cut it anymore. A major shortcoming of this arrangement is that it shields patient data, such as underlying conditions, how they are reacting to treatment, and their demographic information from getting back to the producer. Without this data, drug companies are not able to do patient-centric innovations, something we'll cover in detail later, and develop precision medicines. They're also not able to do targeted advertising for their products. For example, look at the Google search results when you search for a mobile phone. The first links are almost always ads targeted at you based on your location, demography, and other preferences. And look at the search results thrown up for paracetamols, an over-the-counter drug which does not have any limitation on advertising. Not even a single ad, even though each market has dozens of pharmaceutical manufacturers. So that's the most crucial marketing challenge faced by pharma companies today: how to incorporate customer data and analytics into their existing B2B sales channels. The US pharmaceutical market is the largest by far. It accounts for almost half of the world's pharmaceutical spending. An average American pays about $1,100 a year on medicines. Compare that with only $500 for a Brit and less than $250 for a Dane. And it's not really because Americans pop more pills or they're sicker than the rest of the world. An average American just pays vastly more for the same amount of prescription drugs than the rest of the world. Here's the cost comparison between Americans and the rest of the world for some of the world's leading prescription drugs. Americans pay 80% more for Humira, 100% more for Avastin, and 50% more for Harvoni. This difference is actually a function of the disjointed American healthcare system. If you're a pharmaceutical company out with a new drug and you want to sell it around the world, you'd have to get approval from each country's drug regulator. The regulators and their partners ask 4 basic questions from a new drug applicant. Is it safe? Does it work? Is it better than what's already out there? And finally, is it affordable? These last 2 questions, on availability and affordability, is important for setting the price of a new drug. For example, consider Australia. The government body called the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee will tell the Australian national healthcare system what price to buy a new drug at. The pharmaceutical company has the option of either taking up the offered price or giving up on the Australian market entirely. But the US drug regulator, the FDA, does not ask these last 2 questions, only the first 2. So as long as your drug is safe and effective, the FDA allows you to launch it in the US market at whatever price you deem fit, and let the free market decide whether that price is appropriate. Also, the US does not have a national healthcare system that can negotiate a low price for a bulk order. Instead, in the US, it fails to the hundreds of hospital chains, insurance companies, and other buyers to negotiate their own price. Small orders means higher price. That's then passed on to the US consumer. Are there any positive sides to the story of high American drug prices? Well, for one thing, the US consumer has more medicine choices than the rest of the world. So a patient who can afford it has the luxury of trying out multiple medications to see what suits her the best. And there's a more indirect result. The promise of making large profits in the US encourages pharma companies to invest amounts in new drug R&D. Without the US market, drug companies would be hesitant to do this with the knowledge that the rest of the world's advanced markets will work to curtail their pricing. I mean, no company ever made a new drug hoping to recoup its costs in Australia. Given the scenario, it would be appropriate to say that the US consumer pays for new drug research that the rest of the world subsequently enjoys. That's the dilemma of the largest pharma market in the world: how to balance innovation with affordability. Over-the-counter or OTC drugs are sold directly to consumer without a need for a doctor's prescription. These are the tablets, syrups, lotions and ointments we reach for whenever our loved ones have the most common ailments, from a scratchy throat to a headache. Vicks, Crocin, Halls and Vaseline are more than just household names. These brands are associated with symptom relief and a path to feeling better by thousands of families around the world. Some studies suggest that 81% of all adults in developed countries use OTC drugs as primary treatment. In these countries, a list of approved OTC drugs are maintained by the country's drug regulator. Approval is usually given to the active pharmaceutical ingredient or API in the OTC drug, like paracetamol, and not to the finished formulation itself, like Crocin. This gives the different manufacturers enough flexibility to differentiate their products using color, flavor, and extended release mechanisms. Regulatory agencies conduct extensive studies on the active pharmaceutical ingredient to ensure that it meets 3 basic criteria before approving it for over-the-counter use. 1. Over the years, they have been found to be safe and efficient for treating common diseases. 2. They don't pose a risk of overuse, addiction, or misuse because of easy availability. And 3. That there is a standard dosage, labeling, and warnings regimen for all drugs using the same API. Sometimes medications make the jump from prescription to OTC when regulators are satisfied that they meet these criteria. Many popular OTC drugs like Benadryl actually started off as prescription drugs. Making this jump can lead to explosive growth in sales for the same drug. For example, when Japanese regulators approved the allergy drug Elazion for over-the-counter treatment, its sales increased nearly 2,000% within 6 years. The market for OTC drugs is ginormous, clocking in nearly $200 billion in annual sales. The US is the leading contributor, accounting for 30% of these sales. OTC drug sales are high in the US because of the large uninsured population there, who rely extensively on OTC drugs because they do not have the means to consult a primary care physician. Sales of OTC drugs in China and India are relatively small now, but increasing at a fast pace. China is expected to become the largest OTC market in 15 years. By product, over 50% of OTC sales are from cold, flu, and pain remedies, followed by vitamin, weight loss, and other supplements, which account for an additional 30%. This category is growing fast as more and more lifestyle gurus, YouTube channels, and blogs parrot their benefits. Because of the low entry barrier, the OTC market is fragmented and highly competitive, with many different pharma and FMCG players. Although drug companies like GSK and Bayer have huge OTC portfolios, they frequently have to compete with consumer goods makers like P&G and Costco, and pharmacy store brand products like CVS and Walgreens. Private label brands like these pharmacies have been making steady gains into the OTC market, accounting for around 30% of US sales in 2020. These seemingly unrelated companies are interested in the OTC space because, relative to general consumer goods, OTC drug products enjoy strong brand loyalty. And with brand loyalty comes consumer data, the currency of the 21st century. In fact, OTC sales are one of the only ways drug companies can capture their end-user data, something not possible with prescription products where it is blocked by physicians and distributors. And the lure of data, coupled with minimal regulatory requirements on sales, are attracting online pharmacies to the OTC space. And where there is e-commerce, there is Amazon. Amazon began selling OTC products from third-party retailers like Costco more than a decade ago. But recently, it has expanded to offer its own basic care brand, with dozens of items from mouthwash to allergy medicines. It's a good bet that the most existential challenges to GSK and Dr. Reddy's in the OTC space is going to come from online channels and online players like Amazon. Traditional pharma companies also struggle because OTC marketing does not rely on traditional sales channels that they excel at, pitching a product to a doctor. In fact, less than 15% of OTC sales are the result of a patient approaching a healthcare provider. Doctors are hesitant because they're not adequately informed about safety indications, side effects, and disease-specific actions of OTC products. Unless traditional drug companies fix these shortcomings and expand their online and physician channels, they are bound to lose out on the lucrative market for over-the-counter drugs. Generic drugs have been a great boon to global healthcare, bringing down costs of life-saving drugs and making them accessible to the world's poorest. They've also been great for low-cost manufacturing hubs like India, fostering a regional pharmaceutical industry with deep technical savvy and billion-dollar revenues. At its core, the business proposition of a generics manufacturer is pretty simple. Wait for an innovative drug's patent to expire, reverse engineer the drug, and most importantly, sell it for a fraction of the price. But this opening up of the gates to all competition puts tremendous pressure on margins. Look at the suppliers for generic 500 mg paracetamol in India. Dolo from Abbott is available for a rupee 30 paisa per tablet. Think that's cheap? The Sun Pharma variant is available for a rupee. And if you think that's too low, the Cipla variant is available for 80 paisa. And on and on. And it's not just paracetamol. The truth is, the entry barrier to making a lot of the most common generic drugs, from pain relievers to antibiotics, is so low that it becomes a race to the bottom between generic manufacturers. For established companies with large operating costs, like Dr. Reddy's, Lupin, and Sun Pharma, the business of making run-of-the-mill generic drugs is becoming unsustainable. But what is a generic manufacturer to do? Making a jump to an innovator drug company is not practical, considering the R&D challenges and huge investment and risk involved. What if there was a middle way between innovator drugs and run-of-the-mill generics? Enter specialty generics. These are generic drugs in the sense that they are copies of off-patent drugs, but they are made to treat highly specific and advanced disease conditions, like cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune diseases, and multiple sclerosis. These diseases also happen to afflict a lot of older people in very rich countries, where higher drug prices can be charged. Compared to traditional generics, specialty generics have complex manufacturing requirements, higher capex, and tougher routes to regulatory approval. Because they are for uncommon diseases, specialty generics have lower market size. They typically also require special transportation, storage, and handling instructions because these drugs are usually unstable. For these reasons, the specialty generics segment discourages the entry of very small companies who play just based on price. Which means specialty drug makers have more control over pricing and more sustainable business models. In the US, for example, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services define specialty generics as those costing more than $670 per patient per month. This is typically about 30% less than their innovator versions, compared to traditional generics that can be up to 95% cheaper. But specialty generics makers face some unique challenges as well. Their users, who are people suffering from advanced chronic conditions, show a high level of brand loyalty towards their innovator drug company and are hesitant to switch to generic versions. Also, because of high patient costs, makers of specialty generics are forced to explore non-traditional distribution and price support mechanisms. For example, directly engaging with the end users to provide them support in covering insurance co-pays and other out-of-pocket expenses. Despite the challenges, specialty generics are fast becoming a major lifeline to mid-sized pharma companies around the world. They clocked almost $60 billion in sales in 2020. This is Ajay, and this is Janet. They're both star sales reps at the same pharma MNC. They're both great at what they do, consistently exceeding their targets. But Ajay and Janet have recently gotten them and their teams into a bit of trouble through some sloppy emails. In Ajay's case, it started with an epilepsy awareness session with Dr. Gupta, a leading expert. The event was a great success, and the patients left feeling empowered with new information. As for Janet, she ran into Dr. Smith at the hospital today. He's a leading oncology expert she had known for a long time. Dr. Smith mentioned that an upcoming oncology conference would be great to expand his scientific knowledge with latest developments in the field, and wanted to know if Janet's company would support him with travel and registration fees. On the face of it, these interactions are nothing out of the ordinary, like a million others that occur every day between pharma reps and HCPs. But look at how Ajay and Janet talked about these interactions. In Ajay's case, it was an email to finance. Dr. Gupta is following up for payment. Please expedite the approvals, otherwise we'll lose business with the doctor. And Janet wrote to her manager, Dr. Smith is requesting support for registration fees and travel costs to attend an international oncology conference. He's a key KOL and one of the top prescribers of our oncology brands. Request urgent approval. In their emails, Ajay and Janet did not provide any context on their interactions. How long they had known the HCPs, how the epilepsy session went, how an oncology conference can be crucial to expanding an HCP's scientific knowledge. Instead, their vaguely worded emails are open to interpretation. To someone who does not have the context, it may look like something is being offered to the HCP to continue prescribing the company's medicines. Both Ajay and Janet were aware of the company's Code of Business Conduct and Ethics, or COBE, which states that you should never offer anything of value to a healthcare professional to influence their professional judgment or purchasing practices in favor of our products. They know violating COBE can have disciplinary consequences, and that the HCP can also get into trouble with applicable laws. They never meant to do or actually did anything unethical. However, Ajay and Janet were sloppy while communicating. So here are some guidelines for careful communication. 1. Don't email, text, or call when you're under stress. Stress leads to mistakes. 2. Review your emails and texts thoroughly for clarity before hitting send, because communication in any recorded form or medium becomes part of the company records. 3. When in doubt, ask questions and clarify. And 4. Always give context and use the right language. Perspective matters. Here's a contextualized email that Ajay could have written. The awareness session with Dr. Gupta on epilepsy was a great success. I would like to follow up on the status of Dr. Gupta's honorarium for the session. And Janet could have said, this international oncology conference will help Dr. Smith with increasing his knowledge on the latest developments. Please consider extending travel and registration fees to support Dr. Smith. For guidance, please refer to the company's code of practice for promotion and interaction. And remember, if you need any help, you can always reach out to the Dr. Reddy's legal and compliance team. We are here to answer questions and help in any way possible. By the late 1990s, Kodak was sitting on top of the photography world. It was the world leader in film-based photography, selling everything from high-end cameras to chemicals for developing films. If you had asked a Kodak executive then who they considered as competition, he would have dismissively listed others who were in the exact same business. Fujifilm, Sony, maybe Minolta. He would never have mentioned Nokia, or much less Apple, as competition. I mean, what do phone and PC makers have to do with cameras and capturing people's memories? But in the next 10 years, competition from phone-based digital cameras would decimate Kodak's business. As customers discovered, there was no need to carry a different device to take pictures, much less capture it on film and take it to a store for developing. The proud and esteemed Eastman Kodak Company, which came out with its first camera in 1888, was brought to its knees in a short span of 10 years because its leaders couldn't see the wave of the future coming. The story of the spectacular crash of Kodak, repeated in countless business school case studies, is a cautionary tale for the pharmaceutical industry of today. If you were to ask the CEO of Pfizer to list out his competitors today, the answer would be other big pharma companies like J&J and Sanofi. Maybe he might say competition will come from generic drug companies like Teva or Dr. Reddy's. It's unlikely he would ever name an electronic device manufacturer or a big data analytics company. But that's exactly where the future competition to the pharmaceutical industry is emerging, through the field of digital therapeutics, or DX. Digital therapeutics tend to conjure up images of high-tech diagnostic and surgical machinery, like the ones made by GE and Medtronic. Although these would qualify, DX in the modern world encompasses much more, like the health apps that reside on the omnipresent smartphones, tracking our heart rate, blood pressure, daily calorie intake and burn rate. Our lifestyle apps that tell us everything from the best diets to follow, when to get our teeth cleaned, or how to track the menstrual cycle. There are apps and devices made for specific ailments like diabetes, which allow a patient to better manage this chronic condition. Compared to traditional reactive therapies like medicines, these proactive services have one big advantage. They put the patient at the center. So, Dr. Reddy's probably sells the same medicine to an 18-year-old diabetic and to his diabetic grandmother. But the leading digital therapeutics company for diabetes